Hello friends, and welcome again to a Walk in the Garden Bible study. This is part 1 in our study of Genesis chapter 40. And as we're finishing up those last verses of chapter 39, we were looking at the case of Joseph, and we saw where Joseph had now been thrown into prison. He'd been thrown into prison by Potiphar. He was the captain of the guard of Pharaoh's army. And what had happened was Potiphar's wife had tried to seduce Joseph. Joseph had turned her down, basically jilted her. He turned down her advances, wouldn't have nothing to do with it. And as a result, we saw where she had accused him of attempting to molest her to her husband Potiphar. Potiphar got very angry about that. He couldn't believe that Joseph would do such a thing to him after the way he'd treated him and put him in charge of all of his affairs and just kind of gave him a real title, you might say, put him in high esteem in his household. And then how dare would he turn and do this thing to him behind his back? So he threw him into prison. He took his wife's word for it. He believed her account of what had taken place. And basically she had just accused Joseph of doing everything to her that she had actually in reality tried to do to him. And so now we find him in prison. And where we left off is we were looking that, we talked about the fact that you can't keep a good man down. God's hand was still upon Joseph. God was still blessing Joseph. He was still looking out for his every need and providing for him. And as such, it was noticeable. It was noticeable by those around him. And even in prison, the captain of the prison took note of, how he was able to conduct business and how he was able to get things under control. And how he was very informed and very had that in charge type of behavior that he actually elevated him within the prison itself and put him in charge of all the other prisoners. And so there you go, it's God's promotion. And no matter where you're at, no matter what circumstance you're in, whether it be in prison, whether it be in a job situation, whether it be in a foreign land perhaps under duress, if God's hand is upon you, and if God is blessing you, then you're still going to be taken care of. You're still going to be put in and promoted, and nobody's going to be able to hold that from you. And so that's where we kind of left off at. We're going to finish off those last couple of verses there of chapter 39. But what did the Bible tell us? Well, it told us that he was put not only just in prison, but he was put in the prison where the king's prisoners were being held. It's where they were being bound. It's where they were being detained. And it was kind of like, you might think of it as a political prison. It was a political environment. Because these were people that were, in some cases, the closest servants to the king. And of course, if you did anything that displeased the king, if you did anything against his wishes, or just maybe said the wrong thing perhaps, well, he would have you put in prison. And it was no determination on how much time that was going to be. It just determined how long until his wrath got satisfied, until he maybe simmered down and no longer had those ill feelings. Then it could be maybe for a few days, it could be for a few weeks, or it could even be for months or more. I mean, it really could. And so that's where they would find themselves. And this was where the king's prisoners were bound. And because of Joseph's position, well, this is the very prison he was thrown into. And so he was rubbing shoulders with these other, in many cases, these other servants of the king. But it was a severe prison. I mean, all of the prisons were pretty severe back then. But again, it depended on the severity of the situation, but also it was just, there was no rulings or no legalities about how you could treat the prisoners. There was no holds barred. It was whatever the captain of the guard or the prison official, it's whatever they determined, how they were going to treat you, how they were going to handle you, what kind of punishment they were going to inflict upon you. In many cases, it was just totally up to their decision. So if you did well within the prison walls, then perhaps you would be treated a little bit better, and perhaps you could have more favors bestowed upon you. But this is where the political prisoners were being kept. And they had offended the king in some form or fashion. And even with Potiphar, he had the access and the control over the prison as well. But although it seemingly seemed like all others had forsaken Joseph, I mean, he'd been forsaken by his own family, by his own relatives, by his own kindred, and now he seemingly had been forsaken by those who more or less was his adopted family, those who'd taken him in as their trusted servant, and now they'd turned their back on him as well. So he was just kind of on his own. He was kind of destitute. But even regardless of all that, even if he was completely isolated by himself and had no friends, no kin, nobody else that he knew of to talk to, God had not forsaken him. For what does it say? It says, the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. Everything he did prospered. I mean, he couldn't do anything wrong. Everything he touched just seemingly turned to gold. I mean, it just seemingly worked like clockwork. I mean, it did, and the results were always in a positive manner. God designed to pave the way to his enlargement. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he showed him great mercy. So once again, what do we notice? Well, we notice that no gates or no bars can shut out the gracious presence of God from his people. He has promised that he will never leave nor forsake them, and as a result, God gave Joseph favor in the eyes of the keeper of the prison. What does it tell us? It says the keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand. So once again, it was just almost a mirror image of the relationship that he'd had with Potiphar, because he not only turned over the operations of the prison basically to him, but it says that he didn't have to look into anything because he knew it was going to be done correctly. He knew things were going to be done right, and he knew that he could trust him. And so it was very evident in his work ethics, in his countenance, in the way that he carried himself, that he could be trusted. And so that's what he did. He put him in charge. He saw that God was with him, and everything prospered under his hand, and so he entrusted him with the management of the affairs of the prison. So the note we can make here is that a good man will do good wherever he is. If a man has truly got those motivations within himself, he's truly got those characteristics, those motivating things that he'll do in order to treat people the right way, to follow through on his promises, to do if he's given a task to do, he'll do it to the best of his ability. Well, those things, once they've made themselves manifest in his life, and those become trademarks of his life, well then, if that's truly what he's all about, and truly what he is, then it's going to be made manifest no matter what position he's in, whether he's cleaning the floors, whether he's doing janitorial work, whether he's put in charge of maybe taking the bankroll to the bank from his place of business, whether he's put in charge of the accounting, whether he's been put in charge of securing the property, whatever it is. He can be trusted to do that because that's his nature. That's his characteristics. That's what he's known for. And that's who he is. And integrity is best shown when, they always say the definition of integrity is doing the right thing when nobody else is around. When nobody's around to watch you, well then that's when your integrity is going to be on display. You're going to be able to show your true nature. If there's nobody checking up on you, there's nobody overlording you, you're not on camera, you're not on video, you're not having somebody management coming back to backtrack after you and make sure you did it right. Well, that's when integrity kicks in, because you've got the ability, you've got the capability, or the ability, or the temptation, if you will, to do maybe to take things that don't belong to you, or to put things in an improper place, or maybe to shirk some duties and sidestep them and take a shortcut. Well, you've got that capability because you're on your own. But if your true nature is that, hey, I'm going to do the best of my ability no matter what, then that's what you're going to do no matter what situation you find yourself in. And that's exactly what Joseph has proven himself to be to all of those he's worked around, even when he was back home working with his brothers. even in spite of the way he was being treated, and in spite of the possibility of ridicule or even something worse, he still was going to follow through and do the duties that he was entrusted with. And that's why his father gave him extra responsibilities even at his young age, is because he had proven himself to be trustworthy. And if there's one thing that we should have as a Christian especially to be noted for in our lives, it's to be a person of honesty. It's to be a person, we don't hear of that term used too much anymore, trustworthy. But back in the day, that was a word that held high esteem for somebody. And it was an attribute that was taught. It didn't always go over with everybody. Not everybody would take to it. But it was held in high esteem enough to where, if you were in the Boy Scouts or if you're in some kind of club or you're in school, well, they tried to promote trustworthiness. The fact that you could be trusted in whatever your endeavors were, especially when you're dealing with other people. So the keeper of the prison had saw these characteristics in Joseph. He took note of it, and it was just so evident that he got promoted, even while he's in prison. And that's a great testimony about Joseph's character. But a good man will do good wherever he is, and will be a blessing even in bounds, even in shackles, and even in banishment. For the Spirit of the Lord is not bound nor banished. And we could see that in the life of Paul in Philippians chapter 1 and verses 12 and 13. Listen to what it says. It says, "But I would ye should understand, brethren, that the things which happened unto me have fallen out rather unto the furtherance of the gospel, so that my bonds in Christ are manifest in all the palace and in all other places." Wow. Well, that's a powerful statement, because no matter what situation we find ourselves in, we could be homeless. We could be in jail for whatever reason. We could be taken under false pretenses into custody. We could be in a situation where it's, the company shut down and we've been laid off. Or perhaps we got fired. Or perhaps, whatever these situations are. But if we do good, no matter what is it going to result in? It's going to result in the furtherance of the gospel. So God can use us no matter what situation we find ourselves in. You think about accounts throughout the Bible. Think about when Jonah was, in the whale. I say the whale, the big fish. And think about Paul when he was in bonds. And when they were locked up that time, and there was an earthquake and the doors opened, but yet they did the right thing. They stayed right there. They didn't run off. And all of these different accounts we see through the Bible, well, what was the result? Well, it was the furtherance of the gospel. We see that people end up getting saved. People end up getting right with the Lord. People took note of their testimony. Even if they didn't accept right then, it tells us that they took note of it. But it had an impact because of the testimony of the gospel. The Spirit of the Lord was in them, and it was very evident in their lives, no matter who they were encountered with. Well, with that, we're going to pick it up and begin our study of chapter 40, and we're going to see the verses 1 through 4 here. And the Bible says that it came to pass after these things that the butler of the king of Egypt and his baker had offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was wroth against two of his officers, against the chief of the butlers and against the chief of the bakers. And he put them in ward in the house of the captain of the guard, into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, and they continued a season in the ward. Well, here we find another account here, and it's just like what we were talking about. If you're close to people in prominent positions and you mess up, well, especially in this day, then they didn't take it lightly. They didn't just slap you on the wrist. They wanted to make a spectacle out of you. They wanted to make a point, and they wanted to get your attention. It wasn't necessarily they were going to disown you. It wasn't necessarily that you were fired or banished from the kingdom. They just wanted to get your attention and get you to straighten up, basically. And so that's what we see. Here we've got the bakers, or we've got the butler, the chief butler, and the chief baker. And it doesn't tell us exactly what they did, but it does tell us that they had offended their lord, the king of Egypt. They'd offended Pharaoh. Whatever they did. Maybe they said something against his back. Maybe they tried to get away with something within the household. Maybe they weren't handling the staff properly, and it didn't go over good with him. Maybe he had a big gala, and things didn't go just right, and they were held accountable because they were in charge of the situation. So it rolls downhill. And so they were held accountable, and Pharaoh, his anger was kindled, and so he took both of them and put them in prison, put them in the king's prison. And lo and behold, who they were going to be working with, or basically be servants under, is under Joseph's leadership. It just happened to be the ward that Joseph was in, and he was in charge of. And so here we find a situation that's going to be used for the glory of God. And here's an account that most likely took place routinely in such employment of the king of Egypt. This was nothing out of the ordinary. Anytime, I'm sure everybody around there knew, and everybody around there was aware that if you offend Pharaoh, then that is going to be one of the penalties and one of the punishments. It possibly is to be thrown into prison. Unless you can explain your case well enough and get him on your side, then that's what's going to happen. But just like with any dictatorship, those who are closest servants to the king must constantly be on their best behavior. They must constantly be watching out for fear of displeasing the king in any way. Because obviously if you get on his wrong side, then there would be great consequences to pay. And in this particular incident would be forever memorialized in the pages of Scripture, because they were going to play into Joseph's preferment. Joseph was going to be preferred. God was going to work out a situation in order to look out for Joseph. And these two men were going to be used in that situation. And so what does that remind us of? Well, worldly and unscrupulous people are routinely, unwittingly used to accomplish the will of God. We've seen it over and over again where God will use, often He'll use people that are not godly people. They're not Christian people. They may be servants of a false god. But God can still, if that's the best course of action to accomplish His will, then He's still going to use them in order to do that. So what do we see here? Well, first of all, we see that these are two of the officers, the great officers of Pharaoh's court. And they having offended the king, they are committed to prison. And not only just a butler and just a baker, but these were the chief butler and the chief baker of the household. These were the ones that were in charge. They were in control. They were the managers. They were the overseers. They probably had a plethora of staff that was serving under them on a daily basis. And they had a lot to keep up with. They had the menus perhaps to keep up with. They had just the routine services, the cleaning of the place, the managing of the other servants, the controlling of perhaps the household affairs, going and buying the groceries and going and getting the household amenities that they would need on a daily basis. And so there was many things that were under their control to keep the household running smoothly. So these were the ones that were in charge. They held the highest positions in their respective fields. And the king was not happy, and they were going to be held accountable. Someone had to pay the price, and heads would need to roll, just figuratively. So the note we see here is that high places are slippery places. They're dangerous places, and they're places of uncertainty. They're places that can cause one from being a hero and going to zero basically overnight. There were no guarantees. There were no promises. And job security could be jeopardized at the slightest wrong that would be perceived, the slightest wrong move. Secondly, we see they were turned over to the captain of the guard, who, as it turns out, was Potiphar, the keeper of the king's prisoners. And as Potiphar's manner was, he delegated authority and charged Joseph with taking care of them. Whereas Potiphar's manner was, but the captain of his, the chief officer in the prison, was delegated the authority, and he had the authority over Joseph. And what did he do? He charged Joseph with them, and he served them. And they continued a season in that ward. So time was going by. They were building a relationship. They knew each other. They knew how each other operated. And they were probably doing what they were told, just trying to bide their time until they were hoping to get released, and then hopefully they would be restored to their positions. I mean, that was the ultimate goal, was not just to get out of the prison, but to be able to go back to their official duties once again. And so it seems that either, Potiphar got over his wrathful feelings against Joseph, possibly hoping to reconcile with him one day, or maybe he wasn't thoroughly convinced that Joseph was guilty, but he had to put him in this prison just to appease his wife, because he knew that she wasn't going to be satisfied, especially one, if he didn't believe her, and secondly, if he didn't, think it was important enough to get Joseph out of the picture. But by putting him in prison, then that would satisfy her, and they would, be able to have a happy household again. But whatever it was, he wouldn't consider releasing him because of, the fear of upsetting his wife. I mean, that was the biggest thing. He could have gave him a short sentence. He could have gave him just a short term there. But once he got out of there, then she was going to be upset again. She was going to be angry, and she was going to be probably just riding on the captain's back, on Potiphar's back there. But she was perfectly smug and happy that he was in that place, and most likely would be content if he stayed there until he died. That was how bitter she was towards him for, refusing to accept her advances towards him. Well, next we're going to pick it up in verses 5 through 19, and they dreamed, this is talking about the baker and the butler here. It says they dreamed a dream, both of them, each man his dream in one night, each man according to the interpretation of his dream, the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, which were bound in prison. And Joseph came into them in the morning, and looked upon them, and behold, they were sad. And he asked Pharaoh's officers that were with him in the ward of his lord's house, saying, Wherefore look ye so sadly today? And they said unto him, We have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me then, I pray you. And the chief butler told his dream to Joseph, and said unto him, In my dream, behold, a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches, and it was as though it budded, and her blossoms shot forth, and the clusters thereof brought forth ripe grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said unto him, This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days, yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine head, and restore thee unto thy place, and thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand, after the former manner which thou wast his butler. But think on me when it shall be well with thee, and show kindness, I pray thee, unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and here also have I done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, I also was in my dream, and behold, I had 3 white baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there was all manner of baked meats for Pharaoh, and the birds did eat them out of the basket upon my head. And Joseph answered and said, This is the interpretation thereof. The 3 baskets are 3 days, yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head from off thee, and shall hang thee on a tree, and the birds shall eat thy flesh from off thee. Wow. Well, That's quite a contrast in the dreams and quite a contrast in the interpretations for sure. But here we're kind of confronted with another astonishing account. You know, we've already been made aware of how the chief butler and the chief baker in Pharaoh's house had greatly displeased Pharaoh for whatever had been put in these stocks in the same ward as Joseph. But, you know, time had gone by. It says they were in there for a season. And one night, you know, as the manner was, or one morning, Joseph came in to check up on them. And he noticed there was a difference in their countenance. He noticed they weren't their normal selves. They represented themselves as being sad and kind of glum. And so he quizzes them. He says, well, what's going on? I mean, did something happen I don't know about? Is there something I'm not aware of? I mean, you guys look like you're really down and out. And both of them had these special dreams, divinely appointed dreams by God. But all they knew is that they were significant, because nobody has a dream like that. I mean, even if you eat pizza or eat lasagna late at night, you may have some whacked out dreams a little bit, but it's not going to be this type of dream, this specific. And both of them had similarities, so they knew that something was up. They knew that there was, and they were concerned about it, because, you know, as they knew, dreams could possibly be a future prophecy in their lives. It could possibly be something that's going to take place. And they were nervous about it, because what did it mean? I mean, did it indicate that, you know, bad things were coming their way? Was Pharaoh still wroth with them and fixing to take more justice upon them? I mean, they just didn't know. And so, you know, Joseph came in and noticed them in that predicament. And they were very worrisome. They were very troubling dreams, especially as they both experienced them in the same night and they had their similarities. They sensed that these were significant dreams with future implications. But they couldn't make heads or tails out of them. They just didn't know. And they were frustrated because they felt like if they were out and about, if they had their freedom, then maybe they could get somebody that could provide an interpretation. I mean, there was probably people they trusted to do that. Probably some false prophets. Probably some people that advertised themselves as being dream interpreters. And you know, we see that in our society. I mean, you can go into a newspaper, or you can just drive around the town streets sometimes, and you'll see signs of people that are promising to tell your future. You know, they might be palm readers. They might be, you know, they might look at the sticks or look at the rocks. They might look at grains of salt. Or maybe they'll look at the stars and try to read your horoscope for you. And, you know, whatever it is. And if you come to them with a dream, if you pay them some money, well, they might try to interpret your dream for you as well. But there's a lot of falsehoods out there. And we're going to look at some of that in our next lesson. We're going to talk about these dream interpreters. And what about these interpretations of dreams? Do people still have these dreams today? Or are they still having prophetic messages today? So we're going to look at some of that next time as we examine these dreams that the chief baker, and the chief butler had. And we're going to see how that's going to interact there with Joseph. And we'll be talking more about that in our next lesson as we continue our study of chapter 40. Hope to see you then. Hope you had a great day today. We'll talk to you soon.